In the shadowy recesses of human imagination, where light and darkness dance in perpetual tension, the villain emerges, not as a mere antagonist, but as a profound psychological mirror, reflecting the most complex dimensions of our inner landscape. Consider the moment when a child first encounters a story where the villain isn't simply a monster to be defeated, but a wounded soul whose darkness resonates with something deep and uncomfortable within ourselves. Villains are not born, they are forged in the crucibles of trauma, societal rejection, and unresolved psychological wounds. They represent more than narrative obstacles. They are intricate psychological constructs that challenge our most fundamental understanding of human nature. Every great villain carries within them a fractured narrative of potential, a roadmap of how individual pain can transform into systemic destruction. Take Darth Vader, perhaps the most iconic villain in modern mythology. His journey isn't just about galactic conquest, but profound exploration of how personal suffering can metastasize into institutional violence. His transformation from Anakin Skywalker, hopeful Jedi driven by Lovito, a mechanized instrument of imperial oppression, reveals something fundamental about human vulnerability. Each villain carries a similar blueprint, a moment of profound betrayal, a systemic failure, a personal trauma that becomes the catalyst for their descent. The psychological complexity of villains challenges our simplistic moral binaries. They are not mere representations of evil, but intricate embodiments of our collective shadow, those repressed aspects of human experience we collectively refuse to acknowledge. Their narratives expose the thin membrane separating socially acceptable behavior from complete psychological disintegration. Consider the dark triad traits: narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy, not as clinical diagnoses, but as extreme manifestations of survival mechanisms gone awry. Villains become fascinating precisely because they externalize psychological dynamics we all secretly harbor: the desire for control, the impulse to reshape reality according to our wounded perspectives, the seductive power of rejecting societal constraints. Our fascination with villains stems from a profound psychological recognition. They represent the unacknowledged parts of ourselves, the rage we suppress, the ambitions we fear, the traumas we cannot integrate. Every compelling villain carries a kernel of universal human experience, the struggle between individual desire and collective expectation, between personal pain and systemic oppression. The narrative function of villains extends far beyond simple conflict generation. They serve as crucial psychological catalysts, forcing protagonists and, by extension, audiences to confront uncomfortable truths. Their very existence challenges heroic narratives, revealing the fragile constructs of moral absolutism. A truly complex villain doesn't just oppose the hero, they fundamentally interrogate the hero's worldview, exposing systemic hypocrisies and individual limitations. Mythological and contemporary narratives consistently demonstrate that villains are not external monsters, but internalized psychological states. From Shakespearean tragic figures to modern cinematic antagonists, these characters reveal how personal trauma can transform into collective pathology. They are living embodiments of unresolved psychological tensions, walking metaphors for societal dysfunction. The most powerful villains are not those who seek destruction for its own sake, but those whose motivations emerge from a recognizable emotional landscape. Their actions, however destructive, stem from comprehensible, even relatable emotional experiences. Pain, rejection, systematic marginalization. These are the true origins of villainy, not inherent moral corruption. This exploration isn't merely an academic exercise, but a profound psychological investigation. By understanding villains, we understand ourselves or capacities for transformation, our potential for both destruction and redemption. They represent the uncharted territories of human experience, the psychological borderlands where individual agency confronts systemic limitations. As we delve deeper into this complex narrative terrain, we'll uncover how villains are not just characters, but intricate psychological constructs that challenge our most fundamental assumptions about human nature, morality, and personal transformation. They are mirrors reflecting our collective shadow, invitations to explore the most uncomfortable aspects of our shared human experience. The journey into understanding villains is ultimately a journey into understanding ourselves or fears, our potential for both darkness and light, and the complex psychological mechanisms that transform individual pain into collective narratives of power, resistance, and ultimately, potential redemption. The psychological architecture of villainy unraveling narrative complexity. At the core of understanding villains lies a profound recognition of psychological transformation, a journey from individual vulnerability to systemic disruption. The narrative of villainy is never a linear descent, but a complex spiral of trauma, adaptation, and psychological survival. Consider the archetypal progression of psychological wounding. Every villain carries an origin story that transcends simple moral categorization. Take Magneto, from the X-Men Universe Holocaust survivor, whose experiences of systematic persecution transform his worldview from victimhood to revolutionary resistance. His villainy emerges not from inherent malevolence, but from a deeply traumatized survival mechanism. The concentration camps didn't just rob him of family, they fundamentally shattered his belief in collective human compassion. This psychological mechanism reveals a critical insight. Villains are not born, but constructed through intricate interactions between personal experience and systemic oppression. Their transformation represents a radical adaptation to perceived existential threats. When traditional social structures fail to protect or validate an individual's fundamental human dignity, the psychological response can manifest as what society labels villainy. The dark triad traits narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy provide a nuanced framework for understanding these complex psychological dynamics. These are not simply clinical diagnoses, but sophisticated survival strategies developed in response to profound relational and systemic traumas. A narcissistic villain, like Loki from Norse mythology and Marvel narratives, doesn't emerge from a vacuum, but from a complex familial ecosystem of perceived rejection and marginalization. Psychological research increasingly demonstrates that what appears as destructive behavior often represents a sophisticated, albeit maladaptive, coping mechanism. The villain's journey is fundamentally about reclaiming agency in a world experienced as fundamentally unsafe or unjust. Their actions, however destructive, represent an attempt to reconstruct a sense of personal power in response to systemic powerlessness. Consider the remarkable psychological complexity of characters like Walter White from Breaking Bad. His transformation from a mild-mannered chemistry teacher to a methamphetamine kingpin isn't a simple moral decline, but a profound exploration of how systemic economic marginalization and personal medical vulnerability can trigger radical psychological adaptation. White's villainy emerges from a desperate need to secure familial legacy in a system he perceives as fundamentally broken. The narrative function of villains extends far beyond simple antagonism. They serve as crucial psychological mirrors, exposing the fragile constructs of societal normative behavior. By challenging heroic narratives, villains force audiences to confront uncomfortable truth. It's about individual and collective moral complexity. Trauma theory provides a critical lens for understanding these psychological transformations. Villains often represent what psychologists call complex trauma, sophisticated psychological adaptations to prolonged relational or systemic violence. Their seemingly destructive behaviors are, paradoxically, attempts at psychological survival and self-reconstruction. The mythological roots of villainy reveal even deeper psychological patterns. From Greek tragedies to contemporary narratives, villains have consistently represented the externalization of collective societal fears. Medea's infanticide isn't merely a personal act of revenge, but a profound statement about systemic patriarchal oppression. Her actions become a radical rejection of a social structure that renders her fundamentally powerless. This psychological complexity challenges simplistic moral binaries. Villains are not external monsters, but internalized psychological states that reveal profound truths about human vulnerability. Their narratives expose the thin membrane separating socially acceptable behavior from complete psychological disintegration. Contemporary psychological research increasingly recognizes that what society labels as evil often represents sophisticated survival mechanisms. The villain's journey becomes a complex negotiation between individual trauma and collective systemic violence. Their actions, however destructive, emerge from comprehensibly even, relatably emotional experiences. The philosophical dimension of villainy extends into profound existential territory. Characters like Thanos from the Marvel Universe represent more than simple antagonism. They embody complex philosophical perspectives about resource allocation, population dynamics, and collective survival. His genocidal vision, while morally reprehensible, emerges from a twisted form of utilitarian logic. Redemption. Narratives further complicate our understanding of villainous psychology. Characters like Severus Snape from the Harry Potter series demonstrate how individual motivations can transcend simplistic moral categorizations. His complex loyalty, emerging from profound personal love and systemic resistance, reveals the multidimensional nature of human psychological experience. The narrative power of villains lies in their ability to challenge fundamental assumptions about human nature. They are not merely obstacles to be overcome, but crucial psychological catalysts that force protagonists and audiences to confront uncomfortable truths about individual and collective potential for transformation. By exploring the intricate psychological landscapes of villainy, we gain profound insights into human complexity. These characters are not external monsters, but living metaphors for our collective psychological struggles, representations of how individual pain can transform into systemic disruption, and how personal trauma can become a catalyst for radical reimagining of social structures. The villain's journey is ultimately a profound exploration of human potentialia, narrative investigation into the complex psychological mechanisms that transform individual vulnerability into collective resistance. They represent the uncharted territories of human experience, the psychological borderlands where personal agency confronts systemic limitations. As we continue to unravel these complex narrative and psychological dynamics, we move beyond simplistic moral judgments toward a more nuanced understanding of human complexity. The villain becomes not an object of condemnation, but a crucial psychological mirror, reflecting our most profound capacities for transformation, resistance, and potential redemption. The transformative power of narrative complexity. In the intricate tapestry of human experience, villains emerge as profound psychological landscapes, not mere narrative constructs, but living embodiments of our deepest existential struggles. Our exploration reveals that villainy is never a destination, but a complex journey of psychological transformation, a nuanced dialogue between individual trauma and collective systemic violence. The narrative arc of villainy transcends simplistic moral binaries, inviting us into a more profound understanding of human complexity. What initially appears as destructive behavior reveals itself as a sophisticated survival mechanism, a radical adaptation to perceived existential threats. Each villain carries within them a universal human story, narrative of pain, resistance, and the desperate search for meaning and agency. Our psychological journey through these complex characters demonstrates that villainy is not an inherent state, but a dynamic process of adaptation. From Magneto's traumatic Holocaust experiences to Walter White's desperate economic marginalization, these narratives expose the delicate membrane separating socially acceptable behavior from complete psychological transformation. They challenge us to recognize that the distance between heroism and villainy is often far more nuanced than we dare acknowledge. The philosophical implications are profound. Villains serve as crucial psychological mirrors, reflecting our collective fears, unresolved traumas, and the complex mechanisms of human survival. They are not external monsters, but internalized psychological states that reveal fundamental truths about human vulnerability and potential. Their stories become powerful metaphors for individual and collective resistance against systemic oppression. This understanding calls us to a more compassionate and nuanced engagement with human complexity. It demands that we move beyond simplistic judgments of good and evil, recognizing instead the intricate psychological landscapes that shape individual experiences. Our villains are not caricatures to be defeated, but complex narratives waiting to be understood, each representing a unique intersection of personal trauma, systemic challenge, and psychological adaptation. The redemptive potential embedded in these narratives offers a transformative perspective. Characters like Severus Snape demonstrate that human motivation cannot be reduced to binary moral categories. Their stories reveal the profound capacity for complexity, showing how love, loyalty, and resistance can emerge from seemingly destructive psychological experiences. Moreover, these narratives challenge us to confront our own shadow aspects, those repressed qualities and unacknowledged traumas that we collectively suppress. By engaging with villainous narratives, we create space for deeper self-reflection, recognizing that the capacity for both destruction and transformation resides within each of us. The call to action is clear. We must develop a more sophisticated psychological literacy. This means cultivating empathy, recognizing the complex origins of human behavior, and understanding that every narrative of villainy is fundamentally a narrative of survival. We must create social and psychological frameworks that address root causes of trauma, marginalization, and systemic violence. Educational systems, mental health approaches, and social policies must evolve to recognize the complex psychological mechanisms that drive human behavior. This requires moving beyond punitive models toward restorative approaches that acknowledge individual vulnerability and systemic context. Our exploration reveals that villains are not endpoints, but crucial transitional spaces, psychological thresholds, where individual pain confronts collective possibility. They represent the uncharted territories of human potential, demonstrating how personal trauma can be transformed into collective resistance and radical reimagining. The emotional resonance of these narratives lies in their universal human quality. They invite us to recognize our shared vulnerability, our complex capacities for adaptation, and the profound potential for personal and collective transformation. Each villain's story becomes a mirror, reflecting our own unacknowledged struggles, fears, and unrealized potentials. As we conclude this exploration, we are left with a powerful understanding. Villainy is not an absolute state, but a dynamic psychological process. It represents the complex negotiation between individual experience and systemic challenge. Our villains are not external enemies to be conquered, but crucial psychological catalysts that invite deeper understanding of human complexity. The true power of these narratives lies in their ability to expand our collective psychological imagination. They challenge us to move beyond simplistic moral judgments, to recognize the profound humanity embedded in even the most seemingly destructive experiences. They remind us that transformation is always possible, that redemption is a continuous journey, and that our capacity for understanding is far more revolutionary than our capacity for judgment. In embracing the complexity of villainous narratives, we open ourselves to a more nuanced, compassionate understanding of human potential. We recognize that every story of villainy is ultimately a story of survival, resistance, and the profound human capacity for radical reimagining. Our exploration concludes not with resolution, but with an invitation to listen more deeply, to understand more compassionately, and to recognize the transformative power embedded in every human narrative.